colleagues, dear clients, dear friends. Welcome, everyone. I'm Peter Feldberg, the firm managing partner of Fasken. The invasion by Russia into Ukraine is now reaching the end of its third month. We've seen its effects on a global scale. Massive dislocation of people from Ukraine, incredible human suffering, and a war that seems to have neither a legitimate purpose nor a clear outcome. We've seen a remarkable display of resilience by the Ukrainian people and a surprising weakness but emerging brutality in the Russian attack. We've seen the West galvanized in its support for Ukraine with unprecedented sanctions on Russia and certain Russians, and with escalating arms support to Ukraine from NATO countries. We've seen Finland and Sweden react by application to join NATO, Switzerland emerge from total neutrality to support sanctions, and Germany finally picking a side. But we've also seen China quietly support Russia, and many countries simply stand aside. We've seen an incredible display of generosity from Poland and other countries as millions of Ukrainians are absorbed into homes and families. On a human scale, here in Canada, many of us have been touched personally by the war. As the beneficiary of waves of immigration from Ukraine over the last century, Canada finds itself again the beneficiary of refugees. Many of us also have friends or relatives in Ukraine who are living through the trauma. Many businesses are having to make difficult decisions about operations in Russia and are having to address the need to do the right thing with the reality of protecting their colleagues on the ground in Russia from backlash and danger. At an economic level, the sanctions affect all of us, and the energy picture will clearly darken in Europe as the war continues and another winter approaches. The news about the war is constant, and with all news about war, the truth is elusive and difficult to find, not only about events on the ground, but about the bigger picture. Many questions remain. Questions about Putin's resolve, his health, stability, and whether he can continue to hold his place in Russia with what looks like a massive miscalculation unfolding on the ground. We wonder whether nuclear war is a real possibility. Will Putin risk the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in a country where the winds blow to the east? The economic picture is also unclear. Who are the winners from this? Who are the losers? We also question the broader geopolitical implications. The relationship between China and the U.S. is clearly affected, but where are Xi and Biden in all of this? How strong is the relationship between a traditionally xenophobic Russia and China, and who is now the big brother in that relationship? Are there limits to the relationship with no limits? How does the war affect the parts of the world that are neither the West nor clearly allied to Russia? To help us with these and other questions, we're fortunate today to have with us Anne Leahy, a Canadian diplomat with a distinguished career in Canada's Foreign Service, who in conversation with our own Raymond Chrétien will discuss the invasion of Ukraine and its fallout in the world. Together, they will cover the geopolitical, diplomatic, and humanitarian aspects of this conflict, together with its impacts on other countries. I'll turn things over to Raymond Chrétien to introduce Ms. Leahy and to start the conversation, which will be in English and in French. Raymond, for anyone who does not know him, is a partner and strategic advisor to the firm and is the former ambassador of Canada to Mexico, France, the United States, Belgium, and the Congo. Over to you, Raymond.
Merci beaucoup, Peter. Thank you very much, Peter. Now, a few words about Anne Leahy, our guest speaker. Anne was born in Quebec City. Elle a grandi dans cette ville. Elle a fait ses études primaires et secondaires dans cette ville. Later on, she went to Ontario, first to Queen's University, where she obtained a bachelor's degree in economics, and then to the University of Toronto to get a master's degree in economics. She joined the Foreign Service of Canada in 1973. Over the years, she held a number of positions, both at headquarters in Ottawa and abroad. But early on, she kept her interest and developed even more her expertise in European affairs, especially East European affairs. And this is what led her to be appointed first as our ambassador to Poland and then to Russia. She was then the first woman ever appointed to this important and delicate assignment. Anne is fluent in Russian and is considered one of our best experts on Russian issues. Today, she is the real expert. I'm not. I've never served in that part of the world. So therefore, instead of answering questions, as is usually the case, I will ask the questions. Alors, avant de passer à ces questions, une petite parenthèse, a short parenthesis, just to complement what Peter Feldberg just said in his extremely good introduction. Today, we're going to talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's 3 months old, likely to drag on for months, perhaps years to come. But this war takes place also as we live with our new reality of COVID-19 that has already caused millions of deaths around the world, including 40,000 here in Canada. But on top of that, the climate change crisis is getting worse by the day, and major changes will be forced upon us if we want to avoid a catastrophe. I've been involved with international issues for almost 60 years now. But it is the coalescence of these three major threats that makes me particularly nervous. I hope that I'm wrong, but this should be a serious wake-up call. Now, let's get started. I have many questions for Anne. I hope that you will have some too later on. My first question, Anne, is the following. The signs have been clear for quite some time that Vladimir Putin was not happy with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, not happy with the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Belarus, Bulgaria have joined NATO now, despite assurances given to Russia at the time that this would not happen. I've read recently the summary of the conversation between Gorbachev and Secretary Baker of the United States. It's clear that a promise was made to the Russians at that time. My question to you, Anne, is the following. Why now? Why not 3 years? We have seen it coming for years. Why not 3 years ago? Why not a year from now? Why now?
Merci, Raymond, and thank you to Fasken for the invitation. Raymond and I are both members of the Canadian Retired Ambassadors Association, so I'm happy to be able to remind people of our existence as a source of a lot of expertise, actually. So why now? One of the best experts on Russia is Fiona Hill, the American who was once in the National Security Council. And I like the elements that she brought forward. It was evident that something military was underway already in November, December. And that's when it became clear to those in the know that something would happen. But why then and not last July or 2 years ago? I tend to see this as a convergence of a few facts. And you haven't heard this name perhaps in a while, but I think Donald Trump had something to do with it when he negotiated a withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that, I'm sure, was interpreted by President Putin as a withdrawal of the U.S. From its involvement, let's say, in various parts of the world. So then the messy way in which the exit occurred from Afghanistan probably showed Putin that he was right to think that the U.S. were perhaps weaker than they projected. That was something to be exploited. In retrospect, you can see the buildup of signals like this. That he was thinking about this for a while. I think we can certainly go back to July when this huge essay was posted on his website in English and in Russian simultaneously, so that everyone was sure to read it. And again, in retrospect, when you read sentences like, Kiev doesn't need the Donbass, well, when you're not thinking retrospectively, well, okay, that's a way of speaking, but in fact, he really meant it. Other bits and pieces in that essay, by the way, just to jump ahead, make me pessimistic when he assimilates what he thinks is the destruction of the Russian identity, in the sense that recognizing Ukraine as a separate country, a separate identity, is an anti-Russia move. He says that's the equivalent of the use of weapons of mass destruction. And if you know the military doctrine of Russia, they can retaliate, right? So he's really putting down some markers. Other elements, of preparation, we haven't paid much attention to that, but there were amendments to the Constitution that were voted by referendum. It was delayed once because of COVID, but it happened in July 2020. People focused on the fact that it extended his possibility of being president by another 2 mandates until 2036. There were other amendments as well, including one which says that the Russian constitution has priority over international law. It has another amendment that says that the president cannot surrender any part of Russian territory to a foreign power. Read, we really got Crimea now. I can't give it away again. So it's just a culmination. But I think in the immediate, I tend to think that the reading that President Putin made of the only other superpower that counts for them, which is the United States, they read that the U.S. was withdrawing from involvement, for example, Afghanistan, and that was done in a messy way. And then, of course, 2 other big elements. One is Russia very actively interfered to create havoc in the states, not in the elections. And then, of course, the failed coup, what my words, but let's say the insurrection around Capitol Hill on January 6th.
So these are the events you think led them to
precipitate that. And then Peter mentioned it in his opening statement, the speculation about Putin's health. I am in no position to speculate. I've read tons of, Russians love plots. They love to speculate. So there's tons about, about Putin's state of health. I have no way of knowing. But if there is a factor, however, that would also give us a time frame which is a little more hasty than otherwise.
Let's talk about Vladimir Putin right now. He's at the heart of this crisis. I have met Putin myself once in the early 2000s when I was ambassador of Canada to France. This is when the West was trying to bring Russia into many of our key institutions. Remember, there was even talk of Russia becoming a member of NATO at that time. Putin had been in power for barely 2 years. He was then very articulate. He was always very well prepared, very well briefed, even smiling. So obviously, his 22 years in power have changed the man. He's now he seems to be far more isolated, erratic, and angry. So my question to you, Anne, is what do you think are the consequences of the war are or will be on Putin's power in Russia? Will he be able to survive politically? Who could reason with him to stop the war? Could there be a coup? If so, led by whom? I think he's in a horrible corner now. And a cornered Putin is a dangerous man. How do you see it? Many questions there.
Many questions indeed. The regime that Putin now has put in place is a personalist regime. It's more than authoritarian. Everything revolves around him. So that's great power to him, but it also means that people who are at his orders really depend on how well he performs. Because the minute he doesn't deliver what makes them inféodés to Putin, then they all become people who may want to see him go. And again, if you read the Telegram channels, on social media of Russians who are now outside the country, or some who are bravely still in the country, there's a lot of talk about dissatisfaction among particular senior military officers who don't like the way the war was conducted, and also among, we'll call them senior business people, those who haven't met their fate by suicide, or those who haven't fled. So there's a lot of talk, but how solidly is Putin installed? I personally think that what he fears the most is a loss of popularity among the normal people, if I can say. And the normal people are those who have not really benefited all that much recently from the early years after the chaos in Russia. I was in Russia in 96, 99, and there was famine then. There was total array in terms of distribution networks and all that. It was hard. And then you had the period where McDonald's and the Firmenich brand, the access to luxury goods. So and Putin initially managed that with all the oil revenues, but now it's hard times. But Putin, I think, is very concerned about his level of popularity among, let's say, normal Russians. And when he grabbed Crimea, it shot up. And so he probably thought that the action in the Donbass area and now going west would also prop him up, because we tend to forget it now, but Navalny's been in jail now for 2 years. But there were huge demonstrations in Moscow and around the country, not just in Moscow, in 2017, enough that it was really worrying for him. And then you had, an increase in the crackdown. There is less press freedom now than there was in the last years of Brezhnev. There's no freedom of expression. There's certainly no political action outside what is absolutely controlled by the Kremlin. So how long can he maintain that? Because the minute that people around him who benefit from it feel that he's not the person who can continue keeping them in the clover, or worse, that by association they'll suffer sanctions, or we haven't talked about the rule of law here, but
I'll come to this.
But I mean, I wouldn't want to be the person in the photo next to Mr. Putin when he comes up in The Hague, So these are things that I'm sure they're thinking about. I was struck on just before March 25, there was a piece of news there, a news item about Anatoly Chubais. I'm sure some of you that will resonate with you, who fled. It was reported that he had fled Russia and he had been seen in Turkey. Now, Anatoly Chubais is a very smart cookie, and he was around when I was there with Yeltsin. He was there in the administration when Mr. Putin came over in '96 from St. Petersburg, where he was at in the Sobchak administration, by the way, dealing with investors from the German-speaking countries. So he's been in business for a long time. So he came over to Moscow. So there was Chubais, transitioned through Yeltsin with Putin, not in the administration, but heading the RAO, the electricity, the equivalent of Hydro-Quebec here. And if he, the consummate survivor, decided it was time to take a flight to Ankara, as we say in French, il a senti que la soupe était chaude. If at the time, if I may, there were the three young reformers who were called like the three young wolves. There was Boris Nemtsov, there was Sergei Kirienko, and Anatoly Chubais. Chubais is out in Turkey. Nemtsov was shot and killed just a few feet away from the Kremlin on orders by, who knows, but we can guess. And Kirienko, who was very smart, who was prime minister briefly when Prime Minister Chrétien came to Moscow in 1998. He is now the deputy in charge of the administration of Mr. Putin, and he has just recently taken over the transition into the administration of the Donbass of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass. Therefore, you can really see that Putin is going to completely absorb in the Russian Federation those two areas.
And there's no history of coup in Russia. The Tsars, in the past, usually ended their reign by being assassinated. Is there the possibility of a coup by the senior military in Russia if they see that the war is not going how it was supposed to go and dangerous for their future? Do you see this as a possibility?
Well, I think there are various ways to do a coup. Brezhnev shoved aside Khrushchev. There was no coup. He didn't die in his bathtub, but he was shoved aside. Stalin had the good grace of dying in office. So you can't really... I mean, there was a coup. There was definitely a coup against Gorbachev. He survived it for a few months, and then the Soviet Union was dissolved. So there are various ways of doing things.
Une autre question sur les valeurs maintenant. Western leaders talk about our values, democracy, respect for the rule of law, human rights. The Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, uses a totally different language. You have lived with the Russians. You have lived there. Can you compare our values and their values? Putin seems to be talking from a totally different script, and therefore the source of many misunderstandings. What about the values on both sides?
That's the word I don't like, because it means so many different things to different people, particularly if you're talking about states. But having said that, there are 2 points I want to make. The first is, sure, Putin refers to Ilyin, a Russian philosopher close to the Russian Orthodox Church. He refers to state civilization, meaning Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. Putin is a clever member of the KGB who rose to be a lieutenant colonel, mid-level, not high level, who therefore is just he's pragmatic. He's described himself as that, and he's extremely cynical, and he will instrumentalize what works. So Christianity, Christian values works in the sense that it's used as a rebuttal for all the quote-unquote depravity of the West. That's one thing. The second is that in terms of the Russian identity, the question of believing in one God, believing in the throne and the altar being part of the same, the wholeness of the Russian identity, that is extremely useful for whoever sits in the Kremlin. And therefore, there is what we do not have, or we haven't had in a few centuries in Christendom, is the total, coincidence of the church and the civilian, if you want, authorities. So, in Russia, in particular, the head of the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church always supports the agenda, put it this way, of whoever's sitting in the Kremlin, at Tsar. Or there have been exceptions, very brave exceptions, at the turn of the 20th century, at the time of the Civil War in Russia. But the way things are done now, values. This is where there's one point. If there's one point I would like to leave with people today, what we don't talk enough about. It's not so much values, it's the ideology. It's the ideology. And what is this ideology? It's nationalism. And we see the effects in North America, and I include certainly Canada. We don't pay enough attention to this, but it's the use of a feeling of being overwhelmed, local normal people being overwhelmed of not having the same respect as they used to. So you blame it on all sorts of things. So in multi-ethnic contexts, this is very, very powerful. And and I think we have to beware of that. If there's a link to be made between China, you raised China earlier, and I would add India, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Canada, in fact, we're all multi-ethnic nations in a way, is the links between those, the dissatisfied, those who feel humiliated, and reinforcing each other. And there's an international, not of the workers unite or communism, but there's an international of that. And I think what Putin is banking on right now is he's riding on that, and big time in terms of Ukraine.
Parlons maintenant de la Chine. Let's talk about the China angle. Clearly, there's a very close link between China and Russia. Xi Jinping must be following with a great deal of interest what's happening in Ukraine right now. I'm not sure that he's very happy with Russia. But how do you think the way this war is going, could influence Xi Jinping in his own thinking about his own big issue, Taiwan, which has some similarities with the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. What do you think is going through his mind? Do you think it is changing his appetite to reconquer Taiwan as he would like to do?
I have no way of knowing. However, I think if I were, Xi is also a personalist regime, and he has big anniversary dates this year, and I don't think he wants to do anything that's going to make him vulnerable, right, in terms of his own agenda. And that includes not creating any dissatisfaction any more than he has at the moment, and of people around him. And if there's one lesson he must be looking at when he's looking at the Господин Putin, it's that some military are not happy in Russia about how Putin has conducted things, and I don't think Xi wants to create anything that would, threaten his own position right now, because he's doing something that no one else has ever done. That's one thing. So I think that's the most important thing, actually. In terms of Taiwan, you asked me at the very beginning what precipitated the 24 February date here. I don't know if there's something specific to Taiwan, China right now on that, but the Chinese are famously known for being able to look at the long term. So he can keep the present situation going for a long time. The key question here is the United States of America. They're the protector of Taiwan, and there's also another consideration, is that there are boundary disputes in that area. There is Japan. There are other countries who have contentious issues. So I would think that in this year in particular, that Xi would be cautious.
Very careful because of
yes,
the election.
yeah.
So, listen, I've been in the U.S. for almost 7 years, a long time ago. China then was not what China has become for the Americans. It has moved from not an ally, but an adversary to what is perceived now to be an enemy. Even Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on this. It'll be interesting to see how this war is affecting American thinking about Taiwan as well. I mean, there's a security guarantee by the Americans over Taiwan, but a big issue of discussion discussed all the time in the U.S. is, would the U.S. go to war to defend Taiwan? I mean, I would have said 10 years ago there was a very strong chance that would be the case. I'm not so sure now. So, well, this is something to follow very, very closely in the months ago. Another question, it's too early perhaps to talk about to draw historical lessons from this war, but already some serious consequences are apparent. Go ahead about how you see some of those consequences, and I might add some later on myself.
Well, there are a few, and let me start at the ground level before we get into the international order and impunity and this sort of thing. But I found something interesting, again, linked to the question of ideology and identity. Because again, we must remember, Russia is a federation of 21 ethnic republics, by the way. It's not just Russia. But its claim of rewriting history in order to deny Ukraine its identity, really, has, as we all know, had the effect, quite the contrary effect, and people who weren't aware of how specific Ukraine was now realize that. I saw a quote by Olga Marcus in the Israeli paper Haaretz, who said, "I was a Russian-speaking Jew from Kyiv. Now I'm a Ukrainian." So that's a powerful statement. That's a powerful statement. Another I'm like Joe and Lai. I think it's too soon to judge what happened after the French Revolution, so I'm not going to draw lessons of this war. But I'll make a few observations. The others about borders. We've tended to think after, particularly in very peaceful Canada, but we've tended to think after World War II that the borders we knew were the borders that obtained. Particularly, I had a bit of Africa in my CV as well, and I did a peace conference in Africa, and it's absolutely true. I mean, the Africans were stuck with borders that colonial powers gave them, and at least they said, well, we've had enough trouble. We're not going to start around fiddling with our borders. So we tend to think borders. I think the invasion of Ukraine by Russia shows, in fact, that we may be going back to what is perhaps the norm, that borders are very flexible in a way. She would be a little old, but let's say a very old grandmother, Ukrainian, could have lived in the same village somewhere near the Buk River, the separation between European Ukraine and what the Russians think is their Ukraine, would have been in the same village and have 5 different names to the larger entity where she lived. So borders have moved. I think that's one of the lessons. And as you hinted with Taiwan or with other areas where there are conflicts of border conflicts, we may see some people getting bolder. Another impact is, I'll just name 2. You mentioned the perfect storm of climate change, and yesterday's report by the Meteorological Organization is another disaster coming. The perfect storm between climate change and COVID and the war in Ukraine. I hope that the need, particularly for Europeans, to pivot on their supply of energy will be for the good in terms of helping the climate environment, let's say. It certainly, we've seen, has accelerated a lot of timetables in Europe, in Germany. And it's going to precipitate, I know people listen to us from our Western provinces here, but it's going to precipitate the discussion on our exploitation of our own carbohydrate resources and our infrastructure. But that may be something for the good, actually. We now see, planes that run on electricity, and the Norwegians have ships that are all electrical, for example. I mean, another consequence is an exacerbation of migrants, and we had focused on that because of what was happening in Syria or off the coast of Libya for the whole movement out of Africa. And then you remember Angela Merkel, wir schaffen das, managed to take them in. And now, with Ukraine, you have at least 6 million, 6.3 million outside Ukraine, and internally displaced people, about the same amount. So that's a strain. That's a strain. That's in terms of the human cost. We tend to talk in statistics, but in terms of disrupted lives, it's huge. It's huge. And then finally, there's another aspect, and I'll link that to sanctions. We haven't talked about sanctions.
How do you think they'll last? When do you think they could be removed?
First, how long will they be effective? You see, they're effective in certain ways, but then they're already being contourné. You saw that first you had the Italian energy company, now you have a French one and a German one who came to a deal to be able to pay for their energy imports in rubles. They found, 2 bank accounts here and 1 bank account there, and we're not violating any sanctions. So people have read Éric Vuillard, L'Ordre du Jour, right? The companies that profited during the Second World War. I think there'll be the similar book will be written probably. after this is over. But this is my segue into corruption. No one talks about corruption. Corruption is a huge, huge, huge elephant in all our rooms. And the reason Putin is the all-powerful master right now is because of massive scale corruption. And if we can disrupt the patterns of corruption, then this is how it will embolden some people to say we're not profiting anymore, so exit Putin. And here I'm not talking regime change, because that is really not the smart thing, but from the inside, you have the incentive of the people around him, the Russians I'm talking about. But corruption is something which plays everywhere and undermines sanctions.
A few other consequences that are already very visible. I remember during my time in Brussels, which is about 25 years ago, Europeans were then talking about a European pillar for their security, and they didn't want to be dependent totally on the US. Now, clearly, there will be a new architecture for European security emerging out of this. We see the application of both Finland and Sweden to become members of NATO. So this is going to change a lot for European countries themselves. Most NATO countries, you have not mentioned that yet, but have already increased their budget to almost 2%, which is the aspiration, the norm for NATO countries. Even Canada has made a big move in our recent budget to increase our defense budget. So this is going to change a lot in terms of security arrangements in Europe and around the world. You have not mentioned also the food crisis. It's all we feel it here in North America, but in some African countries, South Sudan is already starving. Somalia is a big crisis there. Ethiopia, countries in the Middle East, even Iran is going through a major food crisis. So this is not just the result of this invasion, but remember, Russia and Ukraine are both big exporters of. So this is big already.
Let me make a parallel between the food crisis and the energy crisis. I think that it might be good because of the impact on the exports, not only of cereals but also fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine, and the impact on supply. The same way, and coming after COVID, I think we should look at the way the grain economy is structured. It's really four very major conglomerates who control the movement of fertilizers, seeds, and cereals. Is that a good thing? Probably not. So in addition to dealing with the immediate crisis, the World Food Program and all that, we should ask ourselves, is it time to return to a more fragmented or less oligarchic system of market in terms of food production? The other point, in terms of the consequence of this war, is because you mentioned, of course, Finland and Sweden. Everyone said, it's the contrary to what Putin wants. They're not in yet.
No, the Turks are not very happy with this.
Yes, and what that tells us, and I can't wait for Hungary to start asking about something. And now we have Croatia that started to have demands because they don't like the way the Croats are treated in the Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's the role, we talk about the multipolar world. Timakov, who was the foreign minister for a long time, talked about it. This is a major plank in Putin's worldview as well. But the multipolar world is not just like India, China, Russia, and US as four major poles. It's regional power centers. Again, a little more fragmented world. So Iran, Turkey, Brazil, having perhaps larger spheres of their own spheres of influence. So how does the world order function after that? Where does that leave the UN in terms of a moral force? Because the enforcement of international law, humanitarian law, or understandings as you don't attack each other and this sort of thing, relies on some consensus at least. So how are we going to rebuild that if the consensus is broken down and varies according to the immediate regional interests? I think that's a major challenge. And the other is in terms of crimes against humanity, genocide. I mean, the violations of international humanitarian law. There has to be a way of increasing the control and the policing and the enforcement of that. And that is something on which several of our, let's say, allies are working on in terms of Ukraine.
And you just mentioned the UN. This gives me an idea. A long time ago, I guess, in the early 1960s, I was a young third secretary at our Canada's mission to the UN in New York. This is when the UN was playing really a pivotal role in the affairs of the world. It doesn't seem to be the case right now. It seems that the UN is not as, I don't know if it's vigorous or. I have to be careful here because we have an expert with Louise Fréchette in the room. She might disagree with me, but I mean, you saw the result of the last General Assembly resolution about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I was struck by the number of countries, not necessarily voting against, but abstaining. Obviously, not all countries of the world are seeing eye to eye on this issue. How do you explain this vote or the fact that so many countries are sitting on the fence? Is it an oblique critique of globalization? What's your reading of this?
I think there are various explanations, and some are that it doesn't concern us. This is something European. It's something. We're not directly impacted with that. Others were, let's say, the more client states, obviously. But I wanted to look here because what's interesting, it's a good point. The interesting thing were how the ex-republics of the Soviet Union voted. And and this is because Mr. Putin's immediate goal is to recreate certainly most of the USSR, going back to the historical lands, going back to the Tsar actually. So that's Moldova, north of Kazakhstan, including and Belarus and Ukraine, of course. And so Belarus is no longer an independent country. It's been for a while. But Moldova, for example, who's the next on the list, if you want, they voted in favor of the condemnation. So they're the only ones with Ukraine and Georgia. Of course, we haven't talked about Georgia, but that's the other SSR that lost two autonomous republics to Russia. Who abstained was Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Armenia. So they didn't vote with Russia, they abstained. And those who found a way to go to the bathroom at the time and not participate in the vote are the clients, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan.
Very interesting.
Yes, because they probably, you asked me about the lessons on it, they're looking at maybe next month or 5 months from now.
Now, listen, we have to be a bit fast because we have only 15 minutes to go. I think we have some questions, but I have two questions that we have to discuss quickly, very quickly in a few minutes. I mean, how do you judge the reaction of the U.S. first and then Canada to this crisis so far?
Well, I think the U.S. under President Biden has been playing a key role in taking a decision that is rather novel, which is to make public its intelligence, and thereby preparing public opinion, as well as others who read the cues. Canada has responded. to the best of its means. And there are all sorts of people who criticize all the time, but I think what we don't see, the phone calls that Chrystia Freeland makes, or making her network come into play and that sort of thing, is as a diplomat, you and I know that that's extremely important, and perhaps doesn't get the credit it should. But let's get questions.
Let's get questions.
States, we have a first question, which is what might happen if Trump is eventually reelected? What would happen with NATO and the friendship with Putin? Please, Mr. Chrétien, Mrs. Leahy, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, you're the American expert.
If Trump is reelected, I guess to go there this morning is a bit premature. Listen, clearly that would be a game changer probably for the Americans. Let's see if the Americans cross that bridge in a couple of years. There are so many other big issues that will be popped. And you had something about
before Trump, there'll be the elections at the end of the midterm elections, and I think that we're engaged here as NATO. So the NATO allies, I don't know to what extent in the House or in the Senate or even later with Trump, to what extent they'd like to freelance at that point.
I've known Joe Biden and Tony Blinken quite well during my time in Washington. I must say that I find the American reaction very, very good. First of all, this is Joe Biden at his best. This man has been involved with international issues for 20 years. He's comfortable dealing with this. And I think that the fact that he took a leadership role in reuniting NATO, really going to Ukraine, disseminating armaments of the first order, money by the billions, shows me that on this issue, the Americans should not complain about their president. I think they've been very, very good. In terms of Canada, also you mentioned Mr. Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland. I think she plays a pivotal role in this in our policy towards Russia and Ukraine. I don't think that Canada can play a mediation role right now, as we have in the past played, because we're non grata with the Russians. But who knows? Who knows if Putin is gone in a year or two, that Canada might be able to play such a role. But I think that on this issue, I would kudos to our government. Other question?
Yes. The recent applications by Finland and Sweden to join NATO seem the most obvious indicators that the invasion was a mistake. Will Putin be able to explain away to the general public the significance of these applications? Mrs. Lee.
Well, his general explanation is that NATO is at the behest of the Americans. The Americans are threatening Russia. He accuses them of having orchestrated Maidan. So it won't be too hard.
Mr. Chrétien, what do you think?
Bonne réponse, la même. Autre question?
The same one. Well, this is more social, and I think it does take us away from the military side, but it's really an important one as well, and talking about culture. And it is notable that Putin surrounds himself with imagery of a narrow, traditional masculinity. His support for anti-gay measures makes sense in that context. So what are the attitudes of Russian women to this agenda? Do they feel threatened? Do they accept this portrait of Russian society? And these days, why do Russian women seem to be mostly absent from the political scene?
That one is clearly for you, Anne.
Well,
well, you might have your own thoughts.
Maybe the person hasn't read Femen, with the Pussy Riot, so there are young women who are very. It's true that among the amendments in the constitutional amendments of 2020 is the definition of marriage between a man and a woman. So, and Kirill, of course, the patriarch who speaks very much in support of Putin, has complained about gay parade, but. You have to. There is a gay culture in Moscow and in various republics. You may remember that actually Canada facilitated the exfiltration of some gay, I guess Russians, because they were part of. I can't remember what republic. Anyway, a few years ago, but Yes, the traditional values, and that's, I alluded to that. It's in reaction to what is seen here as depravity in the West and a weakening of the culture, which they seem to read in what's happening in the States and in Europe. Now, women have, there are very strong women. I mean, the chair of the Bank of Russia, the central bank, is an extremely able woman. I mean, Medvedeva, whom I knew when she was the governor of St. Petersburg, is now one of the key allies of Mr. Putin in the Kremlin. So that there are some strong women around.
A question in the same vein. You were also our ambassador to the Holy See.
Yes.
What about religion? We see Vladimir Putin going to mass. We see the Pope pronouncing himself about this invasion. Is it real for Putin? Is he religious, or is it just a fake? Or
I think from what I said earlier, you know, when I added he's very cynical and he's instrumentalizing it. That's the answer.
It's no more serious than that.
You know, the Easter, the presence at Easter at the Cathedral of Christ Savior in Moscow. In fact, you may have seen it on social media. It was taped separately. He wasn't there. He had it. It was taped the day before. It was empty, and then and it wasn't done. Someone slipped there. I'm sure our technicals are better than that. Anyway, someone was able to say, "Hey, that doesn't quite work." So at first, when I was there in 96, 99. So the first, the construction of the Russian identity includes definitely Orthodox Christianity, and therefore he was present. And Lushkov, the mayor, then went to mass and all that. But even then, people say, that's the culture side. It's not the religious side.
But communist Soviet Union was trying to eradicate religion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then they saw how, avis aux gens qui sont dans des sociétés sécularisées in Quebec, is that you can't really do that all that easily. When the Second World War broke out, Stalin realized that he needed the help of the religious clergy, and he had been persecuting the clergy quite strongly, and he stopped everything during the time of the war, so they all contributed to the war effort. So,
what do you think of the Pope's pronouncements?
Which ones?
Our Pope.
He talks a lot.
He talks a lot.
Wait, what do you mean? He's
taking a strong stand, and he has been visible in this debate.
Well, that the Pope's position in terms the Catholic Pope's position here is rather delicate, because definitely in terms of a religious leader, one of the goals of all popes is to reconcile or to bring together again the Orthodox and the Latin churches. And definitely his predecessor, Benedict XVI, when I presented my credentials to the Holy See, it was to Benedict XVI, and I had been briefed on, of course, Canadian relations and all that. The one thing, I'm not revealing any secrets, that the Pope wanted to talk to me because he knew I'd been in Russia, was Russia, Benedict XVI. So there's a fascination with Russia, certainly on the religious side. Now, since the invasion, the Pope has wanted to play the role of the mediator, to keep the channels open on all sides. And it's a little more complicated in this case with Ukraine, because there is a very active Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, which is not a Latin Rite, Byzantine Rite, but reports to the Pope, if you want. And they're, of course, very active in Western Ukraine in particular. So he's not entirely removed from the situation, the Pope, because he has part of his flock, under great stress in Ukraine, and he has reached out to the Patriarch Kirill by phoning him, and keeping the channels open. Some people have said, why is he talking to Kirill, who's supporting Putin? Well, as a diplomat, you would know that it's important. That's the one thing we do. When you don't want to have your picture taken with someone who's unpalatable, well, you send in the diplomats, because in the background, they can do that. They can.
Well, I have one about Canada, and it's a very important one. Do you believe Canada should do more in Europe and in Ukraine? The military or humanitarian aid? How do you feel about our Canadian support?
Well, personally, I think we should get our house in order. We're talking in terms of immigration, in particular, in terms of welcoming refugees and all that. When you hear the Premier of Quebec say, "Look, we can't absorb them. We don't have enough capacity to help people coming in," and then, of course, the scandal of waiting for 2 years before you are 5, horrible delays in getting processing. I personally know people who are in Poland, Canadians in Poland, who went to the border, got Ukrainians' family, and helped to process them. But it's a nightmare. And our people, and I want to say right away that because I was ambassador in Poland, but the current embassy there is doing fantastic work. I mean, they're working. They couldn't work, but it's the system. It's the backlog, and that's been allowed to degenerate. And so we should stop moralizing for a while and just get that house in order. And the same with military. We're offering this and that and the other, and that's great. And our Minister of Defense seems to be very intent, but the procurement system, for Christ's sake, is broken.
It's locked.
So fix that.
Well, I have 2 more questions for both of you, and one that is interesting. Who might replace Putin? Another nationalist? Or do you think that after this, times might change?
Whoever asked that is a well-informed person.
Let's make everyone aware of it. What do you think?
Yeah.
Très bonne question.
Yes, because that's part of the discussion going on. Even at the start of Yeltsin's second term, they wanted to define the Russian idea. It didn't go anywhere. But this is the same debate. And already Kwasniewski, who was president of Poland, met Putin in 2002. He was barely 2 years into his presidency, Putin, and already Putin, Kwasniewski says, wanted to recreate Greater Russia, and all. It's been there for a long time. But some people around those thinkers, those ideologues, thought that they weren't nationalist enough. So there is a debate. There's a spectrum. There's a continuum, but there's a debate. It's something that he's not enough. So would they, move him over but I rather would look at the pragmatic money-making business first. I wouldn't look in the domain of ideas.
Well, in talking about the pragmatic
We have time for
business,
one more question.
One more question, and I think this one will wrap it up for everyone. What do you think is the end game of this war?
That was my final question, actually.
Yes, that is the most important question.
What sort of end game? If Ukraine is going to win, if Russia is going to win, what are the scenarios for future negotiations that are bound to take place at some indeterminate future date? And then we'll ask Eric Bédard will come in and conclude our very good conversation because we're almost up. End game.
There will be eventually a negotiation. But any premature talk about that, and I don't want to engage in that, would counter Ukraine's chances of recovering all its lands, including Crimea. So I'll end it there.
You'll end there. Thank you. Donc, je pense qu'on a fini. Je pense que je vais laisser à Eric le soin de terminer notre rencontre. On a déjà dépassé 2 minutes, là. Eric?
Oui, alors, merci beaucoup, Raymond. Merci beaucoup, Madame Anne-Nehi, ambassadrice du Canada. Je pense que vos propos ont vraiment éclairé notre audience. C'est un débat qui, malheureusement, ne finira pas aujourd'hui et pourrait nous garder très alertes pendant de nombreux mois et surtout aura des impacts pour des années et des années à venir beaucoup plus proches de nous que parfois on est appelé à le penser. I wish to extend my deepest appreciation to Mrs. Anne-Nehi, former ambassador of Canada to both Russia and Poland, for accepting our invitation to join us today and discuss about a topic whose fallout will be with us for years to come. It has been enlightening, and this has allowed us to better understand the current impact of this conflict and the repercussion to come. Je remercie également notre associé, Raymond Chrétien, qui, une fois de plus, nous a amené un invité qui était extraordinaire et vraiment très, très instructif pour l'ensemble de notre audience et pour son implication dans l'événement. Merci à toute l'équipe du marketing. Merci à vous aussi.